Hello, welcome to today's webinar on modernizing mainframe data sources to relational databases. And I am Dustin Froyam. I'm one of the co-founders and VirtualZ. And today I have co-presenting with me Vince Ray, our co-founder and CTO. Hi, Vince.
Hey, Dusty. Looking forward to it.
So I think, Vince, we're going to take a little different spin on this topic today in that, a lot of our webinars have focused on really in the diverse targets we can get to. But today we're going to focus on, the mainframe data sources, and we can talk a little bit about, like Datacom and IMS, and obviously VSAM is one of our specialties. But I guess we could also talk a little bit about tape data and some of the other data sources that we can get to on the mainframe as well. But so we'll start out with just a kind of an overview of PropelZ and the architecture and the functionality. And then we'll kind of dive into some of those more diverse data sources that we can get to and push out to really a big diversity of targets. So Vince, can you just kind of kick us off and talk a little bit about the overall architecture, kind of the distinguishing features and the functions of PropelZ?
Yeah, so I guess one of the most important things to understand is PropelZ is mainframe software. It executes under ZOS. And the idea is that gives it direct access to just about anything on the mainframe. And what's unique to PropelZ is we also have direct access to whatever the target is. Now, the way we do that is we generally leverage the JDBC technology so that from our ZOS application, we're able to target just about anything that has a JDBC driver. That's about 100 different databases. And something we'll touch on a little later on is that we also have the ability to target things that aren't JDBC. So, one of the demos we did recently was taking mainframe data and pushing it to Splunk in the, either on-prem or in the cloud. In that case, we're not writing to a database, we're writing to an application. In that case, we're invoking APIs and so forth to get that data into Splunk. So PropelZ is very open-ended that way on both the input side and the output side. On the input side, generally what we're working with are, Dusty, the kind of things you mentioned, VSAM files, sequential files, tape data, GDGs, traditional mainframe data sources that are sometimes hard to get moved to other platforms. But really, it could be, it's open enough that it could be anything. We've done examples where we tap into mainframe SMF data or mainframe console messages or other types of logs and alerts and so forth. Could be just about anything that way. One of the important things, though, is that a lot of times when you're dealing with mainframe data, the issue is understanding the structure of that data. If I give you a VSAM file, there's no metadata with that file that explains, it's got these 27 columns and this one's, character, text data, this one's binary, this one's floating point, that's kind of assumed to be knowledge of the application that reads and writes these files. With PropelZ, we give you a very easy no code way of giving us metadata, which really is nothing more than something like a COBOL copybook that describes the records that you want to work with. And armed with that, PropelZ doesn't just read that, let's say VSAM file record by record. It can understand at a column level. So it can understand how to break that record apart into its constituent columns. So the target, let's say you're going to take that data into a database, the target database would have all the rows and columns kind of normalized down in the way that you want. And because we can understand what's binary data or floating point or all the other formats, that means that there's no kind of loss of function there. It's not like we treat everything as character data or everything as whatever data. It's truly whatever that data has been defined as is what you're going to end up with on the target database. Now, one of the other cool features in PropelZ is in a lot of cases, and I'm going to say it's probably the majority of folks that we speak to, the goal is to have a replica of that mainframe data somewhere else for some other reason. Maybe you're doing, I don't know, reporting or BI or some type of analytics, or looking to input that data into an AI model. I mean, often in that case, you're looking for snapshots. So you might have the kind of thing where some batch process on your mainframe creates a file. You want to add a step to that takes a copy of that file and puts it in maybe an Oracle database, maybe Snowflake, maybe or whatever target you need it to go to. And that's perfect use case for PropelZ. In other cases, though, you want something more incremental than that. Maybe your data is just enormous and you don't want to go through terabytes of data every day to keep it up to date. Or maybe you don't want just a snapshot. Maybe you want it updated every 5 minutes or whatever it is. So we also give you a way of doing that type of incremental processing. And what we can do is look at the input data that we're working with and understand which of those records have been updated, inserted, deleted, whatever changes have occurred, and then reflect just the changes to the target. So that makes it really practical if you're dealing with just enormous data sets and you don't want to transmit the whole thing over and over again. You just want to keep up with the changes. And it also gives you what I'm going to call near real-time synchronization without having all of that overhead that some folks go through for change data capture. I mean, CDC, change data capture, it's really important for certain use cases, usually where you expect to be able to do updates and rely on the fact that the record you just read is absolutely guaranteed to be the most current. And again, you got that kind of application, then the way you deal with it is probably going to be a change data capture solution. If all you're really looking for is kind of an asynchronous process, I want these two things to stay synchronized, and I want it to be within a few seconds or a few minutes, or whatever your tolerance is good enough for you, then no reason in the world that you need to absorb all of the kind of pain and overhead of a CDC solution. We've spoken to customers that have tried to get that CDC approach running. One literally told us 2 years they spent trying to get that to work, and they eventually gave up on it. With PropelZ, you can get to that same point. Again, depending on what your application needs are, and it's the kind of thing you could do in an hour. It's not the kind of thing that's going to take, forget 2 years. It's not going to take you 2 days typically to do that type of thing. So, the incremental processing is important. I already mentioned that we can support just about any target. If it's not a database target, one of the other things we can do in understanding that data is transform it into, I'm going to call it an industry standard format. So, JSON or XML or CSV or, whatever makes sense to you. So if your idea is that, I don't want to go to a JDBC target, I want to get my data, transform it to a JSON object, and then call a script that drives an API, absolutely, we can help you do that too. And again, because we're doing all of this with the full power of the mainframe behind us, we find pretty incredible throughput here. even in our environment, and keep in mind we're a tiny organization with the world's smallest mainframe. But even in that situation, we see thousands and thousands of rows per second with PropelZ, and I would expect that real enterprise grade mainframe configured with lots of bandwidth and all the things that mainframe customers typically have should see tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of rows per second out of PropelZ. And then finally, one of the other really important points here is that especially when the target is JDBC, almost all of the processing that PropelZ does is zip eligible. So that means you can run PropelZ on your mainframe instance, and as long as you have a zip processor, it's not going to drive up your MLC charges, software costs, all of that other stuff. It runs in a way that's basically free MIPS to the mainframe customer. So really important compared to for instance, if you wrote your own whatever COBOL programs, whatever, to read and understand data and move it somewhere. I mean, typically that's going to be general purpose CPU capacity that certainly can add up, especially if you do a lot of it. With PropelZ, that's not the case. With PropelZ, you can run, as long as you got zip capacity in the LPAR where we're running, there's very little impact on your software environment that way. So, Dusty, what did I miss? Is there anything else
No,
we
I think
should?
no, I think that's a good starting point. So, we focus on we've talked a lot about the targets, but we're getting a lot of requests for more diverse sources too. Like, IMS is coming up a lot. We had a customer that just said, "Hey, we want an easy way to do Db2 to Snowflake." So Vince, could you maybe just talk a little bit about that use case and how our architecture works for that as well?
Yeah. So, if we go just a little bit deeper into PropelZ, it's really three connected parts. There's an input part, a processing part, and an output part. And each of those are kind of independent from one another. So what that means is that, even though, the use case we talk mostly to are things like, read a vsam file or whatever it is there, there's complete freedom to say, you know what, I don't need PropelZ to do that input stage. I'm going to do it some other way. I'm going to materialize those records. Maybe it's a database query. Maybe it's go fetch something over a network. Maybe, like to build on your example, Dusty, maybe what I want to do is I want to do a database query from one database, read those records in, and then turn around and write them to a different database. So maybe a mainframe database to, something in the cloud or, whatever you need to do there. So that's really easy in the PropelZ environment. I'm talking about it as these processing stages, but really that can be as simple as, here's a database utility. We often do this with Db2, for instance. I do a batch query, and instead of writing those records to a file or any of that stuff, I pipe those records directly into PropelZ. PropelZ understands, oh, I don't need to do anything to get my data. Somebody's giving me data, reads the input records directly off that pipeline and keeps doing its processing. So, we have probably 4 or 5 examples of things that we've done that way. One example is network file access. So things like FTP or secure FTP. You can give us a URL, say, go get that data from this particular system with these credentials and all of that. We'll read it in over an FTP connection, and then that becomes the input to PropelZ. So that's one example, and then, again, sky's the limit there. Any system that supports FTP can work that way. And, technically any system that has a URL could work that way. It doesn't have to be FTP. That could be, a web service, whatever you happen to have out there. Number two is, we also have done system-oriented things to showcase how powerful PropelZ could be. One example is SMF data. A lot of sites we speak to, they have this use case where, uh, certainly that SMF data in a lot of sites is very critical to them, and they want to archive it, and they want to guarantee that it's going to, be around forever and ever. Well, so we can use PropelZ to access SMF data in real time, and then, push copies of those records wherever you want them. Maybe you set up a database, maybe, wherever it is. Maybe it's an on-prem thing sitting in your SAN environment, and we're just moving those records 20 feet from the mainframe, but they're going into storage that, pennies on the dollar compared to what it would cost on the mainframe. Absolutely, you could do that sort of thing. Same thing for console messages. I mean, one of the, I'd encourage you to look at the demo we did for this on our website. I mean, what we are able to do is take things like ZOS console messages and push them into, in this case, a vendor product like Splunk. And once they're there, they can be consolidated with other platforms. They can be used. I mean, it's almost like having a poor man's automation system. You can trigger notifications. You do, all sorts of management things with the text of that stuff. So not so important, the details there. What's important is to understand how open PropelZ is that way. And that's what gives us the ability to access, whether it's IMS or Db2 or any of that kind of stuff. For IMS specifically, there are a number of different ways this can be done. Probably the most straightforward way is that recent versions of IMS have a kind of an enterprise add-on product that IBM offers that provides a JDBC query capability for IMS databases. So, in that case, we can actually run that. And then what's really going on here is you give us what amounts to a SQL select statement, which gets resolved by the IMS system. So we're going to read records from that IMS database, and then that's what goes through PropelZ. So, IMS to, Snowflake, or IMS to Oracle, or whatever your target is, fits that model perfectly well. Something else I didn't really spend time on, but we can also do filtered requests here. So, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. It could be that, and there are two ways to think of this. It could be that you don't want all of the records in, whatever your input is. You just want, certain ones. Maybe you have a VSAM file where some of the records are names and addresses and other records are transactions. If you just want to process the transactions, you absolutely could do that. In those kind of cases, it would be pretty common to say, well, I want all of the data, but I want these kind of records to go to this table in the target. I want these other records to go to a different table, and so on and so forth. PropelZ 100% supports that. You also have the ability to do filtering inside the record. So in other words, some columns, but not other columns. I might have first name, last name, and social security number, let's say. And I might not want to send that social security number for security reasons to some database in the cloud. I can do that too. I can say, okay, I'm good to give you the first name, last name, but I'm going to suppress the social security number column. And it's all just a matter of what you define in the metadata. You can define all the fields and get an exact copy. You can define, just a subset of them. And this is execution by execution in PropelZ. So, I could have, some users get to see the whole thing, other users get to see subsets, whatever makes sense operationally. And again, in it, all of the combinations that we're talking about, targets, different sources, different targets, and so forth, all of that can run, concurrently. So, I might have one really important file, whatever it is on my mainframe, a Db2 database, whatever it is, and I might want it to go to 5 different places, to support 5 different application needs. PropelZ can do that. It can do that sequentially if you want, or it can do that in parallel. Either way is fine for us. A lot would just depend on the needs of the application, how much bandwidth you have, and where these other components are. All right, Dusty, what did I miss?
No, I think that's good. I have a question, but I'm going to save it for the Q&A section. So let me just, Vince covered a number of different use cases. Actually, PropelZ is extremely flexible in what it supports. And so the pricing is this, and we're very transparent about our pricing. It's on our website. So PropelZ is $50,000 per year per customer. No installation limits, no LPARs, no MIPS, nothing like that. It's really an enterprise license for $50,000. And that does ship with a set of drivers that we have optimized and pre-tested. So SQL, MySQL, Oracle, Snowflake, and Postgres. And then if you want us to test and optimize a driver for you, and package that, it's just a fairly nominal upcharge, $5,000 to $10,000 per driver, depending on that driver. And some of these are not just open source drivers. The ones that we ship, they are proprietary, again, very high performing drivers. So there's some distinct advantage for using the drivers that we package and ship with PropelZ. And then so there's really no hidden cost to that. It supports all of those particular use cases. And so that's gonna bring me into the Q&A section. So if there's any questions out there, please drop those in chat, or I can unmute mics as well. But Vince, I had received a question, and I know this is coming up with a lot of different customers. They're asking us to support tape data migration. And so that's actually really a sweet spot for PropelZ. Can you just kind of talk to that particular use case and how PropelZ supports that, and some of the advantages of how we can store those tape files in the database, either for recall to the mainframe or for use of modernized applications out there as well?
Yeah, no, that is it just seems to be a use case that comes up quite a bit. The challenge there usually is just understanding the inventory of what you're trying to move. If you have, let's say you have a virtual tape library that you want to migrate away from, and replace that with storage in the cloud one way or another. So it is exactly the scenario I described with PropelZ to do the data movement. But there's another piece on top of that, which is, well, how do I know what inputs to use? There could be a million files that I have to move. There could be petabytes of data. There could be, a lot of complexity in that. And, more than that, specifically with tape, a lot of times the information about, this catalog of where all of these files are can be in a few different places. It could certainly be in, the ZOS system catalogs, but it can also be in things like your tape management system, or, some other place like that. So usually, in addition to, just out of the box PropelZ, there's a layer on top of that, which is all about how do I get the inventory of files that need to be migrated. And again, that's not, that's something we can certainly help create, but it's something that's going to vary a little bit depending on, which tape management product you have. You might be running, CA1 or TLMS or RMM or whatever it happens to be, and the way you go about getting that inventory is going to be a little different depending on the tape management system in use. So then the second part of that is, let's say we figure all of that out. Now we have a list of all of the files that need to be moved. There might be, 1 million data sets at that level. So now the question gets to be, what's the most efficient way to get them from the mainframe to whatever the target is? And usually what we would do there is, we've created a very simple way that we can run, I'm going to call it massively parallel PropelZ. So, you set some parameters, based on network capacity and other things I have going on. I want to run 20 PropelZ instances concurrently, and we'll go through that list and migrate as quickly as possible based on whatever constraints you give us. And again, sometimes it's not about get it done as fast as possible. Sometimes it's about be careful not to saturate the network too much so that you impact other applications. So we give you all of those controls to decide how much throttling to do, how much parallelism, all of that kind of stuff happens in there. The other thing, just talking about the structure you end up with, typically, and again, a lot of this is going to vary depending on what your exact needs are. But in a lot of cases, what you're going to do with that data, if you need it, is just stage it back to the mainframe. So, it's not really that you're looking to move that data to the cloud with the intent of running applications in the cloud to read and write that data. If you need to do that, we can do that too. But, it helps to understand the use case a little bit there. So when we go to the cloud with PropelZ this way, one of the interesting things we do is that as we're writing all of these files to, think of it as different tables in whatever targets you've specified, we're also indexing that data. So now you have the kind of mainframe application that says, you know what, I want to position forward to block number 4,000,002. We can do that with a database query without having to sequentially read through all of that data. So if it's the kind of thing where you just need to fetch a handful of records out of that data that's now sitting in the cloud, that becomes kind of an instantaneous transaction. That's not move a terabyte of data and then find what you want. That's position to what you need and just read the records that you need. So, very dramatic improvement there. And of course, because the targets we're talking about are typically databases, you have full power of the query language there. So get me records where that first name column matches, Vince or Vince asterisk. And again, you got a way more flexible way to access that data than you did when it was on tape. And then for some reason, if you do need that tape, if you want to recreate the original tape that you started out with, we can give you, it's kind of, I'm going to call it anti-PropelZ. It's the opposite of PropelZ that can bring those records back to the mainframe and write a mainframe data set with them. So, you got some, I don't know, low-level ZOS application that relies on the structure of the tape that you started out with. You can get back to that very, very easily in just a couple of minutes with with PropelZ as we're talking about it. So, all of these different things come into play. And of course, probably goes without saying, but, depending on the target you choose, the cloud vendor adds a lot of value here too. So, just as an example, if I'm using Amazon RDS as a database in the cloud, I have replication, I have fault tolerance, I have encryption of the data at rest, I have, all of those features that are implied by RDS apply to PropelZ also. We get the benefit of, whatever the target supplies. So, many different, features are possible there, and it makes it, much easier to get to, and especially these things that require big migrations of data, makes them much simpler than they otherwise would be. And I can't say that it's just run PropelZ with this option and you're done. There's a little bit of thought and planning and customization that goes into it in these cases, but it's absolutely thing we can help with, and we find those kind of projects can happen a lot more smoothly with something like PropelZ inside.
All right, thanks, Vince. So, in the interest of time, I'm gonna point. There's a couple other questions, and I'm gonna point those to some other resources that we have. So, Vince mentioned a new demonstration with PropelZ to Splunk, and that was published yesterday. So that's available on our website or our YouTube channel. There's also a great demo of kind of end to end of PropelZ. So taking a very complex vsam file, moving it into MySQL, and then in this particular case, it's being presented in Tableau. And I think Vince install to that presentation of Tableau in real time is about under an hour. So that just kind of demonstrates the ease of installation, setup, configuration, and getting value out of it. And then we've got a ton of other resources, blogs, demos of our other products, obviously replays of these webinars, and some future upcoming events. And we do have, I'll just kind of tease, we do have some joint webinars. Google is presenting our products as well as AWS that are coming out in the future as well. So keep your eye out for those sessions. Those will be great interactive sessions. So Vince, thanks so much for helping present today, and I hope everyone else has a great rest of their week.